endurance. So if you're attending the presentation hoping to see Mr. Kirkwood, you're in the right place because we're about to get started. His presentation tonight will be on his book, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals and the Battle of Gettysburg. Please limit your entries in the chat box to questions related to that subject so that we can easily find the questions when it's time to do that part of the program. We're going to ask you to go ahead and mute your microphone. And again, that's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you'll go ahead and click the mute button so that we don't have any interruptions or background noise while Mr. Kirkwood's program is going on. And then we will be ready to get started. Don't forget to enter your questions in the chat box as we go along so that you can maybe inspire someone else to ask a question, and also so that you won't forget what you were going to ask.
You.
Welcome to tonight's virtual Civil War presentation brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's guest is Ronald D. Kirkwood, discussing his book, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals and the Battle of Gettysburg, published by Savas Beatty last year. This series is provided by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're pleased to be able to bring these fantastic programs to you via the live virtual platform. If you aren't already a member of CivilWarTalk.com, we'll be providing some information about how to join later on in the program, and we hope everyone will become a member.
Our guest tonight, Ronald D. Kirkwood, is retired after a 40-year career as an editor and writer in newspapers and magazines, including USA Today, the Baltimore Sun, the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania Patriot News, and the York, Pennsylvania Daily Record. Ronald edited national magazines for US Today Sports and was NFL editor for US Today Sports Weekly. He has won numerous state, regional, and national awards for his writing and editing, and he managed the copy desk in Harrisburg when the newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize in 2012. Mr. Kirkwood is a native of Dowagiac and Sister Lakes, Michigan, and a graduate of Central Michigan University, where he has returned as a guest speaker to journalism classes as part of the school's Hearst Visiting Professional Series. Ronald and his wife Barbara live in York. They have 2 daughters, 2 sons-in-law, and 5 grandchildren. Tonight, Mr. Kirkwood will be discussing his book, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals in the Battle of Gettysburg, published by Savas Beatty in 2019. The first edition sold out in only 4 months. The second edition is expected to sell out shortly, and the book is scheduled to be released in paperback in January 2021. Please join me in welcoming Ronald D. Kirkwood.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Tina. Thanks so much for having me with Civil War Talk tonight. Happy Veterans Day to all. Today and every day, actually. And I would also like to add a personal note, honoring my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Kirkwood from Dowagiac, Michigan, who fought with the 19th Michigan, and he was with Sherman. He went through Atlanta and he went to Savannah and then up to the Carolinas, and he made it home, and he had a 50th wedding anniversary 50 years later. So it was a happy ending for great-grandpa Thomas. So I will share my screen. How's that? We're good? Okay.
I can see it looks good.
We can get rolling. I'm excited to share the story of this farm. This was such an important farm. In fact, I argue in my book that this was the most important farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. So I'll discuss that first. We'll discuss the 2 hospitals that were on the George Spangler farm. We'll discuss the Spanglers themselves, and we'll discuss the last 3 days of Confederate Brigadier General Lewis Armistead's life, which he spent at Spangler. Now on that map at left, you see the Army of the Potomac line. And marked out in gray next to the line is the George Spangler farm. It's 166 acres. It's huge. It dominates the countryside behind the line. And look how close it is to the line. It's close to the left flank, and which is the round top. See how close it is to the round tops. That will be important later. It's close to the center of the line and it's close to the right flank of the line. Then you have the roads. Granite Schoolhouse Lane cut right through the middle of the farm, and it's marked by the blue arrow. Blacksmith Shop Road is marked by the blue X's and cuts down to the south, leading directly to the round tops. This farm had the size, and it had the location, and it had the roads to be a major player. To hold infantry in reserve, to hold artillery in reserve, and then get them to the line quickly. This was a farm that could win a battle. See if I can get it back. There we go. Hopefully that's our only stick up tonight. This is a Spangler farm, and this is how the Army of the Potomac used their farm. You can see number 4 is a Granite Schoolhouse Hospital, and number 9 is the Artillery Reserve, and we'll get those into great detail in those pretty soon. Now on the right, you see a bivouac. Everybody, I'm sure, in this group is well familiar with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the 20th Maine, the rest of the 5th Corps regiments that rushed to Little Round Top, got there just in time to save the hill. Well, they got there so quickly because they spent the afternoon of July 2nd, guess where? On the George Spangler farm to the right and to the farms on the farms next to it. So later in the afternoon around 5, they got the call, get to the line. So part of the 5th Corps rushed down Granite Schoolhouse Lane, and they made a left turn off the lane and cut across the Spangler fields. The other part of the Corps went down Blacksmith Shop Road. The 5th Corps had just left Spangler when the 6th Corps moved in, that same spot, but they weren't there long before they too were told to rush to the line, and that's what they did down Granite Schoolhouse Lane. Later on the evening of July 2nd, from Culp's Hill, one division of the 12th Corps, they leave Culp's Hill and they rush through Spangler on Granite Schoolhouse Lane. And thanks to that convenient road, they got there just in time. General George Meade had his main street, and it was Granite Schoolhouse Lane in the middle of the George Spangler farm. Now, you've got the 11th Corps Hospital at number 10. That's the Spanglers' house, their outbuildings, their barn. That's at number 10. Accompanying the 11th Corps medical staff are 100 ambulances, and they're placed where you can see on the map in 2 fields. And they're there when they're not out on the battlefield and when they're not at East Cemetery Hill, where the 11th Corps was mainly located. You have the ammunition train accompanying the artillery reserve. They provide the artillery ammunition for all of the Army. So they arrived at Spangler in the afternoon of July 2nd with 24,000 artillery rounds. They were so busy on the night of July 2nd and July 3rd with batteries rushing back and forth from Spangler that they went from 24,000 rounds one day to 4,000 rounds when they left Spangler on July 3rd. Now you've got artillery and infantry also in reserve on the east side of the farm. I mean, on the left side of the map here and the west side of the farm. Powers Hill, 2/3 of this hill is owned by George Spangler. The other third is owned by Nathaniel Leitner. General Henry Slocum, 12th Corps commander, sets up his headquarters at the top and at the bottom of Powers Hill. And he's there for 5 days. You've got more artillery up there and you've got more infantry up there on Powers Hill. Then we have General Meade. He's, as you all know, is on the Taneytown Road till July 3rd when he gets bombed out of the Lydia Leicester house. So where does he go? He goes to Spangler. He goes to the top of Powers Hill, watches the rest of the battle from Spangler land. Now, when the battle ends, he goes back to the front, but then later that night on July 3rd, he returns to Spangler. He sets up his Army headquarters on Powers Hill. Now, there's no sign for it now, and there really should be, but his headquarters was right down the hill, at the base of the hill along the Baltimore Pike. There's a General Henry Slocum monument there. That's where Meade's headquarters were on July 3rd and 4th until the thunderstorms on the 4th pushed him inside. So Meade had his headquarters for 24 hours or so, maybe not that long, on the George Spangler farm. Now, this photo is one artillery battery. That's all the men and horses and wagons to make one artillery battery. So knowing that, imagine 19 of those on the Spanglers farm arriving all day long on July 2nd. It was just a miles and miles long parade, a parade of them arriving at Spangler. Each of the 7 Union infantry corps at Gettysburg had their own artillery, totaling about 200 cannons among the 7 corps. These cannons went where their assigned corps went. The artillery reserve added 106 cannons and 2,300 more men and 23 more horses. They added a lot more power. But the best thing about the artillery reserve is the cannons based at Spangler on July 2nd and 3rd didn't have to go where the infantry corps went. They were the crucial utility players that could be plugged in anywhere in the line where they were needed. And that's exactly what George Meade and Artillery Chief Henry Hunt did on the last 2 days of the battle. They rushed cannons from Spangler to the line, often only with moments to spare, to prevent a Confederate breakthrough. Artillery reserve batteries left Spangler and they went out and they fought at the Peach Orchard. They fought at the Trossel Farm. They fought at the Plum Run line. They fought at the Cadore Farm. They fought all along Seminary Ridge. They were at Cemetery Hill. They were at East Cemetery Hill. And they even fought on Powers Hill on George Spangler land. Most of you have probably seen this photo of the Trossel Farm with all of the dead horses all around the house and all around the barn. Those are 9th Massachusetts battery horses, all those dead horses. And 2 hours before they were killed, they were at Spangler. So all those horses were also based at Spangler. Other farms saw a lot more combat than the George Spangler farm at Gettysburg, and others were literally destroyed by it. But no single farm played a greater strategic and logistical role with its 2 roads, with Powers Hill, and it's in the middle of it all location than the George Spangler farm did in setting up the Army of the Potomac victory in the biggest battle of the Civil War. The first hospital. The 1st Division caught the heaviest of the blow. Many killed and wounded were the result, and the latter were now being brought to the hospital in great numbers. Granite Schoolhouse surgeon in charge, Dr. William Warren Potter of the 57th New York. Granite Schoolhouse was only built in the early 1860s when the Spanglers donated the land in the middle of their farm for it. On days 2 and 3 of the battle, there was a major 1st Division 2nd Corps Army of the Potomac hospital in the fields and woods around this school. This hospital has received little attention since the battle, and little has been revealed about it until my book came out, and I think that's a shame. Right now, it's just overgrown, unmarked land with thorns and poison ivy that make it difficult to enter, as shown in that photo in the bottom left of the screen. This hospital hosted the 1st Division 2nd Corps wounded and dying men who fought at Rosewoods. They fought at the Wheatfield, which was one of the most well-known places on the battlefield. These were the fighters of the famous Fighting Irish Brigade. This was a division of Father William Corby, who gave the men general absolution moments before they went into their day 2 fight, thus clearing their path to heaven. This was the Corps of General Hancock. More than 1,000 men of the 1st Division were casualties on just that one day of fighting. And by the end of July 2nd, most of those wounded were either at the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital, at the Granite Schoolhouse, on the George Spangler farm, or they were waiting to be taken there. Chaplain John Henry Wilbrand Stuckenberg of Erie in the 145th Pennsylvania served at the Granite Schoolhouse Hospital. He said, "Our hospital was at the foot of Powers Hill. I found the doctors and nurses busily engaged with the wounded, scattered around in all directions, some lying on blankets, some on straw, a few on stretchers, others on the bare ground. Private Erastus Allen of Company G, shot through the abdomen, suffered terribly. Some of the intestines protruded through the wound, and some of their contents would occasionally flow out, producing a horrible stench. It was very evident that our regiment had again suffered severely." 2nd Corps Ambulance Chief Lieutenant Tom Livermore, New Hampshire, made numerous deliveries to Granite Schoolhouse on July 2nd. He said, "Here under the shelter of some boulders lay a large number of our wounded and dead who had been brought from the field. They lay upon the ground covered with their blankets, and the living were nearly all silent, having fallen asleep from fatigue." Brigadier General Samuel K. Zook was treated at the school on July 2nd for a massive chest wound before dying in a house farther behind the line on July 3rd. His wound opened such a gaping hole that a doctor could see the general's heart beating. This monument on the left at the wheat field marks where General Zook was mortally wounded. Colonel Edward Cross, 5th New Hampshire, died July 2nd at Granite Schoolhouse. After being mortally wounded on the opposite side of the wheat field from General Zook, Cross Avenue between Devil's Den and the wheat field bears his name. Colonel Cross was beloved as a great fighter in New Hampshire and by many of his men, but he was despised by others for his drinking and tantrums. His unit's Pioneer Corps called him a tyrant and refused to bury him. The monument in the middle of the page honors Cross and his fighters. Lieutenant George A. Woodruff at the top right of the page, the 1st United States Artillery Battery I was mortally wounded on July 3rd during Pickett's charge when he was hit in the back while he was facing and directing his men at Ziegler's Grove. The son of a Michigan judge died at Granite Schoolhouse, telling his friends that he regretted being shot in the back and asking that it be no reflection upon his character. Many of the 1st Division 2nd Corps, most of the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital at Granite Schoolhouse was moved to safety farther behind the line on day 3 after 24 hours of intense service because it was getting hit by Confederate artillery overshots from the pre-Pickett's charge cannonade. This is what the property looks like today. It's just been basically ignored and abandoned. The school was torn down in 1921 and nothing remains of it, except the foundation of the building, but it's buried under decades of growth. This fallen tree in the middle accidentally marks the site of the school. The open fields where the wounded and dying men of the Wheatfield fight lay next to the school are now covered in woods and overgrowth. Gettysburg is dotted with markers at hospital sites, and my hope is that someday the National Park Service does the same for Granite Schoolhouse. This was an important hospital and it needs to be honored. One day cured me of a hospital. Give me the picket line every time in place of a hospital. Captain Matthew B. Cheney, 154th New York, after visiting the 11th Corps Hospital. 11th Corps medical staffers picked the Spanglers farm for a hospital on July 1st because of its proximity to the evolving front line and access to water and access to crops and livestock for food. Buildings for hospital purposes, good roads, and wood for operating tables, fires, and caskets. While the 1st Division 2nd Corps Hospital used the school on Spangler land, the 11th Corps Hospital used the Spanglers barn, summer kitchen, house, other outbuildings, and fields. Family of 6, during the Battle of Gettysburg lived here. George Spangler was 47 and Elizabeth Spangler was 44. 4 children, all of whom were living at home in 1863. 21-year-old Harriet, 19-year-old Sabina, 17-year-old Daniel, and 14-year-old Benaiah, who went by BJ. The 6 Spanglers were ordered by the 11th Corps doctors on July 1st to either leave the farm or stay together out of the way in one upstairs bedroom. So that bedroom is where they lived during the 5 weeks and 2 days that their home was occupied for a hospital. They could leave the room, but in doing so, they had to step over and around wounded and dying Union officers to get out of their house. The farm of Spangler's neighbors, the Lightners, also was used as a hospital, and the Lightners left because the smells of the house made them sick. The ambulance corps started delivering 11th Corps and other wounded to Spangler at about 4 o'clock on July 1st. At the hospital's peak attendance on July 4th and 5th, the Christian and Sanitary Commissions estimated that there were about 1,900 wounded there. Of those 1,900, there were between 50 and 100 Confederates. Dr. Daniel G Britton of Westchester, Pennsylvania said, "The wounded soon began to pour in, giving us such sufficient occupation that from the 1st of July till the afternoon of the 5th, I was not absent from the hospital more than once, and then but for an hour or two. Very hard work it was too, and little sleep fell to our share. 4 operating tables were going night and day. Many of them were hurt in the most shocking manner by shells. My experience at Chancellorsville was nothing compared to this, and I never wished to see such another sight. For myself, I think I never was more exhausted." This is where surgeries and amputations took place under the forebay of the Spanglers' barn. There, doctors could have more light and fresh air away from the smells and crowds inside the barn. Surgeons worked here with their backs to the wall of the barn. A surgeon could finish an amputation in 5 to 15 minutes and then move immediately to the next one. No washing required of bloody or germ-infested hands or bloody equipment because they did not understand how proper sanitation could prevent infection and reduce the spread of disease. A Spangler surgeon approaching total exhaustion called the work too much for human endurance. Private William Southerton, age 19, 75th Ohio, said, "At this doorway, I saw a huge stack of amputated arms and legs, a stack as high as my head. The most horrible thing I ever saw in my life. I wish I had never seen it. I sickened." Amputated limbs were loaded into a wagon or a wheelbarrow and buried. The amputations and surgeries and wounds attracted an infestation of flies that relentlessly harassed everyone. Pigeons in the barn added to the filth, and hornets added to the pain. Then there were the maggots that covered wounds and stumps. Infections were expected after a Civil War surgery, and the worst infections could be smelled 8 to 10 feet away. So you can imagine the stench that greeted a hospital staffer or visitor in the barn or when entering a tent with 8 to 10 men all suffering from infections. To help battle these smells, Spangler workers cut branches off pine trees and hung them on the tents and used them inside for bedding. Spanglers had a classic Pennsylvania bank barn. You see them all over Pennsylvania. They stretch into Ohio a little bit. They stretch into Maryland a little bit. I think they're works of art, and I think they're so classically functional. I just think they're beautiful. The key parts of a Pennsylvania bank barn are the 7-foot forebay that I showed you that hangs over in the front, and then the bank in the back, so the farmer could drive his wagon right up into the top floor of the barn and load and unload his crops. And these barns were brought over by the Swiss and the Germans in the 17 to 1800s. So the Spanglers, being a good German descendant family, they built the Pennsylvania bank barn. And when you drive around the Gettysburg battlefield, look for a Pennsylvania bank barn. There are multiple variations of them, but they're all the same thing with the forebay in the front and the barn in the back. Men were crammed so closely together in the Spangler's barn that it caused the spread of diseases. Some men died of these diseases rather than the battle wound that brought them to the hospital. All of this hospital was horrific. All of this barn was horrific, but it was the worst under the forebay where the amputations took place and just inside the front wall of the stable. That's where many of the worst cases awaited their surgery amid cries of agony and smells of infection, body fluids, and human feces. Cries and screams could be heard 50 yards away in the Spangler's house. Hospital workers covered their head with a pillow at night to try to drown out the sounds. Nurses read scripture and prayed with the men in an attempt to help send them on their way and take their mind off their agony and their situation. Outside in the Spangler fields, the Army didn't provide enough tents or bedding or food or clothes for the first several days, multiplying the misery of the wounded and dying men who were forced to lie in the mud in the open when the thunderstorms came. Corporal William R. Kiefer, a hospital steward from the 153rd Pennsylvania up in the Allentown Easton area, said hundreds were lying with but feeble or in most cases with no shelter, exposed to a cold, incessant rain against the sides of the barn. And in an orchard adjoining the sheds, their moans were heard in every direction. And with a lantern, I moved about from one to another during the long hours of the night. I searched in vain for blankets to cover the suffering and dying. Two female nurses played key roles at Spangler. Marilla Hovey and her 17-year-old son Frank traveled with her husband, Dr. Bleecker Lansing Hovey of the 136th New York, and she was always one of the first to reach the hospital during a battle. Unfortunately, no photos of Mrs. Hovey are known to exist today. The Hoveys are the one and only surgeon's family known to have traveled together during the Civil War. Mrs. Hovey nursed the wounded and wrote home to family members of the dead and dying. She was able to go into sort of an autopilot mode, look past their terrible wounds and suffering, and hold the hands of dying soldiers and talk to them in a desperate attempt to get their mind off their agony and their situation. In one letter from Spangler, Mrs. Hovey informed a family of their son's death and told them, "I have had a good deal of care of him and called him my soldier boy and tried to take the place of mother, sister, and friend. I think I never had such a trial parting with one that I had no more acquaintance with." The Hoveys worked at the 11th Corps Hospital for the entire 5 weeks it was open. Then they went home to New York to take a 3-week break and recover. Nurse Rebecca Lane Pennypacker Price of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, rode to Gettysburg on a bench in a railroad car in the middle of the night because she had donations shortly after the battle. Then, after delivering the donations, she went to work as an unpaid nurse at Spangler. She said, "The sad scenes would fill a volume. So many times at night, I lay on my stretcher, weeping instead of sleeping." Captain Augustus Vignos, 107th Ohio, was wounded on July 1st on what is now Barlow Knoll. Gangrene developed and his right arm was amputated above the elbow at Spangler. Mrs. Price nursed him from near death until he was well enough to take a train home to Canton, Ohio. He went on to marry in 1866, have 9 children and many grandchildren, while assessing substantial wealth as a businessman. He was a pallbearer at the funeral of close friend, President William McKinley. Vignos carried Mrs. Price's photo for 40 years after the war. He often showed her photo to fellow ex-soldiers at national encampments in an attempt to find and thank her, but he never had any luck. But finally, in 1906, he received a letter. That letter said, "Dear sir, do you remember the tall nurse at Gettysburg who furnished you with clothing so that you could go home?" Mrs. Price had found him. Vignos replied that he looked forward to seeing her with great pleasure, and their reunion took place at a GAR encampment in New York State in 1906, 43 years after they met at the Spanglers farm. This is my wife, Barb. We spent a week at Cornell University during the research phase of the book. We went through 19 boxes like the boxes shown there. Boxes that were so dirty so filthy that when we were done after that week, the Cornell Library closed the exhibit and they declared it hazardous materials. And nobody else has been able to go into those boxes since then. But I am so grateful that we did, because not only did I find lots of materials on men of the 154th New York who were on the hospital staff there, who were patients there, but those guys were there when General Armistead arrived. They watched him and they wrote about and they talked about what they saw of General Armistead. And I very gratefully and very luckily just walked in to new material on General Armistead while I was looking for information in those 19 filthy boxes at Cornell University. So let's go on to Mr. Armistead. Armistead began the final walk of his life on what would become known as Pickett's Charge on the Seminary Ridge farm of Henry Spangler on July 3rd. He would die 2 days later on the farm of Henry's half-brother, George Spangler. Armistead arrived, and again, this is information coming from Cornell out of those dirty boxes. Armistead arrived at George and Elizabeth Spangler's farm at dusk on July 3rd, 1863, according to Dr. Henry Van Arnhem of the 154th New York. Armistead arrived in an ambulance. He was removed on a stretcher and placed on the ground next to the ambulance and near the Spanglers' barn. 11th Corps Hospital workers Private Emery Sweetland and Private Edson Ames of the 154th New York described Armistead's appearance as pretty bloody and covered with blood. Sweetland heard Armistead as he lay on the stretcher say, "You have a man here that is not afraid to die." Now, the Spanglers' property was a shoulder-to-shoulder mass of chaos, agony, and crying when Armistead arrived. This was after Pickett's Charge. Many wounded from Pickett's Charge were pouring in as overwhelmed surgeons desperately tried to find who could be saved with immediate attention. Even so, the arrival of the Confederate general turned heads, and a large crowd of workers and gawkers formed around his stretcher, circling Armistead. The crowd was eventually and finally broken up when Dr. Van Arnhem arrived at Armistead's side and ordered that he be carried away for treatment. Fellow Spangler patient, First Lieutenant T.C. Holland, 28th Virginia, said he and Armistead were placed in the orchard. Lieutenant Holland said at one point under the trees that Armistead asked the doctors and nurses working around him to please don't step so close to me. Dr. Van Arnhem described Armistead as wild, nervous, flighty, saying war must cease, men of same blood, and he could not live. Spangler patient, Private Justice Silliman of the 17th Connecticut, described the 46-year-old Armistead as rather past middle-aged. Private Sweetland said Armistead had gray hair and whiskers. Dr. J. Kling of the 55th Ohio said Armistead was suffering intense pain induced by the wound. Stimulants and painkillers were immediately given him. Dr. Britton took time to get to know Armistead, calling him a fine man, intelligent and refined. I had considerable conversation with him and was much pleased with his manners and language. Armistead died July 5th in the summer kitchen, which is that separate building to the right of the Spanglers' house. That's where they did all of their cooking. They had no kitchen in their house. Army of the Potomac Captain Frederick Stowe, the son of Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, was Armistead's roommate in the building, which was reserved for VIPs. Stowe lived. Armistead was wrapped in a blanket and placed in a coffin made of wood from the Spanglers' farm, and he was buried in their orchard. 1 month later, he was exhumed by an embalmer from Philadelphia who was seeking to make money off his body. So Armistead was dug up after 1 month in a coffin. His body was embalmed in whatever condition it was in and then reburied. His body was dug up one more time in October when relatives claimed it and reburied him with other relatives in Baltimore. I have found, confirmed, and listed the names, wound, and treatment of 1,436 Union and Confederate men at the Spangler 11th Corps Hospital and the names of almost 140 men who were buried in the Spanglers' peach and apple orchards. The Union men were exhumed within a few months after the battle and reburied in Soldiers National Cemetery in Gettysburg, where President Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. Most Confederates, other than Armistead, lay in Gettysburg until 1872, when they were exhumed and reburied across the South. Armistead is one of 5 Confederates known to have been buried at Spangler. 50-year-old Colonel Eliakim Sherrill, 126th New York, died in the Spanglers' house. His funeral in Geneva drew lines of people that stretched several blocks. His image is on the monument to the 126th New York in Ziegler's Grove. Assistant Surgeon William S. Moore of the 61st Ohio died at Spangler. He was the only Army of the Potomac surgeon or assistant surgeon to die at Gettysburg. He left behind 1-year-old and 2-year-old children and young widow Sarah, who was so torn by grief that she mourned for the rest of her life, and she never remarried. Colonel Francis Mahler of the 75th Pennsylvania died in the Spanglers' house. The Philadelphia City Council honored him with a resolution and paid for his funeral. His brother, Second Lieutenant Lewis Mahler, died on the battlefield on July 1st at about the time and place of his brother's mortal wounding. Sergeant Nelson Jones, 3rd Maine, died at Spangler after being hit in both legs in the peach orchard by an artillery shell. He died even though he made and applied tourniquets to his legs on the battlefield. Sergeant Jones was 20 or 21 years old. Private George Nixon of the 73rd Ohio died at Spangler. He would become the great-grandfather of President Richard M. Nixon. George Nixon was 40 years old when he entered the Army as a poor man working on a rented farm. He left behind a wife and 9 children when he went off to war, probably only enlisting to make money to support his family. Adjutant and First Lieutenant Joseph Heaney, age 21, 157th New York, died of a leg wound at Spangler. Nurse Price walked next to his stretcher and held an umbrella over him to protect him from the July sun as he was taken to the Spangler barn for an amputation. First Lieutenant Thomas Wheeler, 75th Ohio, age 25, spent almost a month at Spangler before he died of 4 wounds. His parents were at his side, and Nurse Price sang Rock of Ages to him as he died. Many soldiers didn't always tell the whole story of the seriousness of their wounds in their letters home from Spangler because they didn't want their family to worry. Sergeant Henry Seas of the 82nd Ohio wrote this letter to his brother. My leg was amputated just above the knee. I stood the operation very well, being under the influence of chloroform. I am very well cared for and in a fair way to get along well. I hope mother will not worry herself about me. Sergeant Seas died 1 week later after writing that letter. Many died at the 11th Corps Hospital who were the lone source of income for their sickly parents back home. Many died at Spangler as teenagers. 19-year-old drummer Thaddeus Reynolds of the 154th New York was in such agony from lockjaw as he neared death that doctors put him under with chloroform just so he could die in peace. Corporal Andrew Mayberry of the 20th Maine died at Spangler, leaving behind wife Hannah and 5 children ages 6 months to 11 years. One father arrived at Spangler one day after his son died. One wife arrived a few days after her husband's death. Of course, they found out about their loved one's death when they arrived in Gettysburg. But the vast majority of 11th Corps hospital patients survived thanks to Civil War medicine. They included Captain Alfred E. Lee, 82nd Ohio, went home from Spangler with a hip wound, and he found his obituary in the newspaper. Then he walked in on his funeral. Brigadier General Francis Barlow spent a week at Spangler with 3 wounds that numerous doctors declared to be mortal. But he surprised all of them and lived. It is thought that his wife, Arabella, attended him for the week that he was at Spangler. Corporal James Brownlee of the 134th New York survived 7 gunshot wounds at the Brickyard on July 1st one of which broke 4 ribs. Also, he was shot 3 times through the bowels. Private Justice Silliman, 17th Connecticut, was knocked out by a shot to the head on July 1st. He was taken to 3 different Confederate hospitals in Gettysburg before arriving at Spangler on July 4th. He healed and became a nurse at both Spangler and Camp Letterman. He said of one scene at Spangler, the barn more resembled a butcher shop than any other institution. One citizen ongoing near it fainted away and had to be carried off. If you combine the number of wounded at Granite Schoolhouse with the number of wounded at the 11th Corps Hospital, then the Spanglers hosted almost 3,000 wounded soldiers on their property, more than the entire population of Gettysburg of 2,400 at the time. The surgeons at Spangler were among the best of the best for their time, and they saved far more lives than they lost. Just like the soldiers, these surgeons were taken prisoner, they were wounded, they got sick, and they suffered. Many Spangler surgeons died in their 30s and 40s because of the exposure to disease, their horrifying work, poor food, long marches, and unsanitary camp life. I dug up in my book, researched the names of 15 head surgeons who worked at the 11th Corps Hospital, and most of them went on to leadership roles in medicine and their community after the war. When you study these guys, you feel like you get to know them and their families, and you can't help but be affectionate toward them. But these 3 guys, these are 3 of my many favorites. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry Van Arnhem, who, like I said earlier, had much treatment of Armistead. 154th New York, was a passionate opponent of slavery who wanted full civil rights for Blacks. He said, "The curse of God visits on all that come in contact with this atrocious institution." Dr. Van Arnhem served 4 terms as a United States congressman, but sadly, unknown to Dr. Van Arnhem, his nephew and namesake, 22-year-old Captain Henry Van Arnhem Fuller, 64th New York, was killed July 2nd in Rosewoods at Gettysburg, while Dr. Van Arnhem worked nearby at Spangler. I read a lot of Dr. Van Arnhem's letters home, and every one he constantly told his wife how much he missed her. Spangler surgeon Dr. Henry K. Neff of the 153rd Pennsylvania was captured at Chancellorsville and held prisoner for 4 weeks, and his health never recovered. He was sick with pneumonia as he cared for others at Spangler, and he remained sick after he was transferred to work at Camp Letterman later in July. He died not long after the war at age 45. Spangler surgeon Dr. J. Kling, another one who worked on Armistead. The 55th Ohio was captured by Confederate cavalry while I was on his way home and imprisoned for 3 months after being mustered out in Georgia in 1864. He filed a claim to the government for losses sustained and expenses incurred, but was denied because he was taken prisoner after he was mustered out. The 11th Corps wounded continued to be sent away until the Spanglers finally got their farm back on August 7th, at least what was left of it. George Spangler filed 3 damage claims to the state and federal governments totaling about $5,000, but they received only $90. And it's believed that the entire $90 went to their Washington, D.C. attorney, so they got nothing. In defending the decision, the U.S. quartermaster's agent said, "The government of the United States is no more responsible for bringing on the battle fought there than it would have been had a tornado passed over that country, causing as widespread destruction as did that terrible engagement. The battle and hospital damage was his misfortune." The top photo is often used and is one of only 2 known photos of members of the George Spangler immediate family. And this is one of their youngest son, Benaiah, his wife, Sarah, and daughter, Mary Elizabeth. It was probably taken in 1888 for the 25th anniversary of the battle. Benaiah and his family were living on the farm and running it at that point after his parents had purchased a smaller farm next door and moved there. This photo shows how well the Spanglers rebuilt their farm after the battle, even adding everything to the left of that white porch that you can see on the house in the photo. You can see their smokehouse to the left where they where they salted and dried their meats to preserve them. You can see their little outhouse behind there. You can see the white picket fence, which was common around farmyards back in the day. On the summer kitchen, you can see the grape arbor where they grew grapes and they sat under the grapes, the arbors for shade to do other work. You can see the barn on the right. It looks today like it looked then, and the other outbuildings that they had there at the time. The bottom photo at the right is the other known photo. This photo was taken in 1886 or 1887, and this is in front of Granite Schoolhouse. It includes 4 members of George's family. This is where Mary Elizabeth attended school on her grandfather's farm, just a quarter of a mile walk from the house. Benaiah is at the far left, marked by the blue X, looking like he just walked off the set of the Fiddler of the Roof movie. Benaiah was on the township school board at the time. Daughter Mary Elizabeth is marked by the blue star. Hopefully you can see it. Clara Patterson is under the arrow, and Alice Patterson is under the oval. They are the daughters of George and Elizabeth Spangler's second child, Sabina Patterson. Teacher Maggie Swartz, if you can see her, is on the right, and she's holding a ruler. In front with the dog, that's little Raphael Sherfy of the Peach Orchard family, Sherfy. Now, when this photo was taken, little Raphael's father was already dead. Despite that, he went on to become a dentist, and he went on to become well-known in a distinguished member of the community. George Spangler was chairman of the Cumberland Township School Board when he donated the land for the Granite Schoolhouse in 1861. He also was a church and Adams County leader, serving on several boards, including the Evergreen Cemetery Board that voted to allow no Confederate burials there. A teacher whom George hired said, "Mr. Spangler proved himself to be a very efficient school official and made a lasting impression on my mind as a man of truthfulness and honesty in all things." Elizabeth Spangler took care of her widower father in his later years and made sure he was buried next to her and George. Spanglers also took in a niece after George's sister Susanna died. All 4 Spangler children became productive adults. Harriet and Sabina married local farmers and had families. Daniel moved to Kansas to use his carpentry skills in the growing new state and settled near Abilene around the time that Wild Bill Hickok was marshal there in the early 1870s. Benaiah worked the family farm for many years until he gave up farming and moved into Gettysburg at about 1890. As was common in families those days, tragedy followed the Spanglers. George's daughter Harriet died 2 months after he died. Then Harriet's daughter Annie died a few months after her mother. So Elizabeth lost her husband, a daughter, and a granddaughter in a little more than 2 months. One of Daniel's 2 sons drowned in Kansas, and Benaiah's only grandchild died as a toddler. That's what the barn looked like when the Gettysburg Foundation purchased it in 2008. They completely rebuilt it, and they now open the farm to visitors and offer programs and tours on weekends, on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays in June, July, and August. Please note that if you visit the farm today and go into that barn, that most of that wood is the wood that was there in 1863. So that's the wood that the men lay on, and the wood that the men lay next to. Also in that barn, there's some, there was a log cabin barn on the property when the Spanglers bought it. And the Spanglers tore it down and used some of that 1700s log cabin wood. So there's 1700s log cabin wood in that barn as well. I'm going to finish my last slide with Private James R Middlebrook, 17th Connecticut. He wrote to his wife Frances from Spangler he was a hospital steward there. He said, "It is enough to make one's heart bleed to witness the amputations. I feel it my duty to do all I can for them. I cannot see them suffer and shall stay as long as I can stand it." Private Middlebrook survived until the end of the Civil War. And after nearly 3 years of service and all those battles and all that suffering and all that movement all over the East Coast, it was a fight in Gettysburg and his work at Spangler Hospital that Middlebrook remembered most in one of his last letters home before being mustered out. He wrote, "Make up your mind to travel home when we get home." He wrote on July 2nd, 1865. "I think of going to that place long to be remembered, Gettysburg." That's all. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And veterans, thank you so much again for all you've done. Happy Veterans Day.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kirkwood. That was fantastic. I enjoyed it very much, and I know everybody else did. It looks like we have plenty of questions already in the chat box, but in case you had thought of a question and you haven't yet entered it, go ahead and enter the chat box, and we will address those in just a moment. I'll read those questions off and ask Mr. Kirkwood to answer them in the order that they appear in the chat box. In the meantime, before we get to the question and answers, I'd like to introduce you to Mike Kendra, the owner of CivilWarTalk.com, and he will tell us about the forum and about membership. Mike?
Hello, everybody. I wanted to say a few words for you, everybody, and thank Mr. Kirkwood for doing a great presentation. Wow, that was the fastest hour we've had in a long time. It was a great presentation, so thanks for doing that for us.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Mike Kendra, and I'm the owner of Civil War Talk. And tonight we had a great presentation by Ronald Kirkwood. He's our guest presenter on Zoom, and this is a great opportunity to learn about another great piece of American history. And if you're an author of a great Civil War book or a battlefield guide or a researcher or collector, and you have a great story to tell, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk to you about providing a presentation like the one we did tonight. And if not, you could do, let's see. If you prefer not to do one of these Zoom presentations, we can work with you on a book launch at CivilWarTalk.com or schedule a book launch today at Civil War Talk. We love our weekly Civil War Talk Presents programs, but there's more to Civil War Talk that you won't experience in a Zoom meeting. We have our share of everyday visitors who share stories and do research, but we also have a large community of historians and reenactors and students. I'd even say fanatics of the American Civil War. Many of us don't even read just stories, but we also are fans of the Civil War that we love to live and learn about. It's our passion. Civil War Talk had its origins way back in 1999, but today we've grown into a modern community with over 24,000 members and over 116,000 different discussions about the war between the states. Membership in our community has always been free, and it's really easy to join too. So if you want to avoid those pesky Google advertisements on our site and also get first shot at registering for our future Zoom meetings and other great perks, you can support Civil War Talk with a premium membership for as little as $12 a year. You'll support our community and get lots of other great perks. So I want to invite everybody to join our community today. And if you haven't already, you'll find stories that you'll cherish. You'll find knowledge that'll thrill you, and it'll challenge and enlighten you. And you'll also find friends that will last a lifetime. So join Civil War Talk tonight, and we hope to see you all in the community soon.
Thanks, Mike. I hope everybody will become a member so that we can continue this discussion about the hospitals at the George Spangler farm. Mr. Kirkwood, if you're ready to get to those questions, we can go ahead and get started with those. And if you think of questions and you haven't entered them yet, you can go ahead and do that. Even though we're going to start answering them, we'll get to as many as we can. And then if we have questions that we're not able to answer in the time that we have, we will ask Mr. Kirkwood to please answer those possibly on the forum, or if he's a member, and if not, to become a member and answer questions that we may not have time to get to, but hopefully we'll be able to get to them all. There's a lot though, Ron. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. So let's see. The first question is about the Granite Schoolhouse property, and people were concerned about it being overgrown and that kind of thing. So can you tell us a little bit more about that property? Is it part of the battlefield, or is it?
Granite Schoolhouse Lane, like I showed on the map, cuts right through the Spangler farm, or back in the day it did. Today it separates On the north side of the Granite Schoolhouse Lane is Gettysburg Foundation property. That's where the farm is now. It's down from 166 acres to 80 acres. The north side of Granite Schoolhouse Lane is where the hospital was and where the school was. It's all woods. Between the Granite Schoolhouse site and Powers Hill was almost an open field when it was a hospital. And that's where the men lay, beneath Powers Hill and between the hill and the school. And then they did the surgeries and the amputations up close and around the school, and actually in the few woods. So there were a few woods around there, but mainly it was an open field. Today it's all woods, And I've been making some requests for the Park Service, and I hope to have a meeting soon. I've been talking via email. They agree something needs to be done. I've been talking to Historic Gettysburg Adams County, which puts up hospital signs, and they're all in favor of getting a sign there. And I think that's a good first step, because there are many residents of Adams County who would drive right by that spot and have no idea what happened there, and where the school was and how important it was. So it really, really needs to be honored. And now that we have the information, we can do it.
Right. That'd be great. I'd love to see it recognized, at least a sign, and clean up the property so we know where it was.
Hopefully, if anybody comes in next year, maybe there'll be a sign there, as my hope, as the big first step.
That'd be great. David would like to know a question that's often asked: did doctors use any antiseptics during their treatment of wounded soldiers, such as alcohol, iodine, or botanicals?
Yeah, they had first of all, prior to the surgery, they used ether and chloroform to put them out. I mean, obviously they didn't bite a stick like they did in the Revolutionary War, and the guys held them down. There was a surgeon and 2 assistants there, but no, the guys were out. They didn't know anything about antiseptics at that time. They didn't know about preventing an infection at that time. So they might wash off their knife with water, but they didn't change their aprons. And these guys had, they had germ covered hands, and they might stick their hand inside a guy and pass along some disease that the guy didn't have before. So they had rudimentary stuff, and they had morphine. So that helped a lot with the pain. And like I said in the talk, they used chloroform just to take guys out of their misery too when they were dying, because it was so bad, some of them. So they had a variety of things, and they had hospital stewards were the pharmacists. So they had drugs for various things, and whiskey and brandy for shock, homesickness, lots of things like that.
Okay, let's see. Richard would like to know, what was life like for the disabled soldier when he returned home?
Some of their life was just fine. Some of these guys returned to their normal life with an amputated arm or an amputated leg, and they were fine. One guy at Spangler had a hole in his head that revealed his brain. You could see his brain through the hole in his head. They did whatever they could for him. They couldn't cover it up so you could always see his brain. He couldn't work much when you get that extent of a disease or illness, or injury. So he worked a little bit, but mainly he was on a pension. A lot of guys just went home with a pension. Some guys had an arm amputated, and they came back and fought, like Augustus Vignos of the 107th Ohio, who was trying to locate Mrs. Price. He had his arm amputated, and he came back and fought later in the war. That was so common. A lot of guys went into like a veterans reserve force who were wounded, and they couldn't fight anymore, and they could do help at hospitals and things like that. So they had lesser work for a lot of those guys that they could do. And it varied by each soldier. Some guys could do it. Some guys could handle it. Some guys just weren't quite up to it. So it's like it is today. It depends on the person too.
Right. Gordon would like to know, after about the 5th of July, what was the flow of wounded like? Not having read the book yet, when were the remaining wounded moved to the Letterman Hospital?
Okay, that's a great question too. July 4th and 5th were the busiest days at the hospital, because most of the 11th Corps guys from July 1st were trapped because the Confederates moved through their line so quickly they were trapped behind Confederate lines. So they were taken to Confederate hospitals. So once the Confederates retreated on the 4th, then the 11th Corps ambulances could get out to the Brickyard. They could get out to Barlow Knoll. And so they spent the 4th and the morning of the 5th just bringing guys in. And then they were packed on the 5th. And then on the 6th, they started sending them out a little bit in wagons. And then on the 7th, they got the bridges fixed up because the Confederates had destroyed a lot of bridges in the area, the railroad bridges. So the railroad started running on the 7th. And then it really started to clean out then. Like July 15th, 400 or 500 guys went out at a time from the farm. And then about late July, they started moving them to Camp Letterman on ambulances out there. And then by August 6th or 7th, like I said, they were all gone, and the Spanglers, it was just the Spanglers on their farm again. But it was really that took the opening of the railroads for the mass moving of the wounded to really take place.
Brian would like to know about the retrieval of remains. He said, I'm interested if you've run into any information about families who came to get their loved ones' remains. He has an uncle, several greats, that died on the 3rd from the 12th New Jersey, and he somehow was returned home, and he just curious about how that would have occurred.
Once families got there in the first half of the month, they were allowed to be taken home. Later in the month, the government stopped that policy because they wanted them to be buried in the cemetery that was going to be coming up. So it depends upon when the family got there. If you got there early enough, you could take your family member home. If you didn't get there till later, then the government says, no, sorry, the body's going to have to stay here. And those ones are in Soldiers National Cemetery right now.
So only those whose family actually went to Gettysburg. So it wasn't there. None of them were
No.
seen.
No. Like one guy from 17th Connecticut died at Camp Letterman. And this is an interesting one. He did get to go home. So I guess they did make exceptions, but Private Silliman, who I had in my talk, he accompanied his body home. He had him embalmed first and took him home. So that happened a lot. So like I'm talking about the government regulations, no, you can't do this, but they did get around it a lot. If they really wanted their family member home, many of them found a way to do it. I think I heard even of some lawsuits involving that type of thing.
Wow.
Now we want our boy home. So.
Right. Richard had another question. He just retired from 40 years as a prosthetist, I guess, a person who does prosthesis, I guess, at the Edward Hines Jr. VA hospital outside Chicago. And those kind of services weren't available back then, but what did the government have available, and what kind of services after a wounded, a guy who had who had an amputation, then what kind of services were available when they got home?
I didn't really look into that, but from my little bit of research, because that happened after Spangler and after Camp Letterman, most of the guys didn't have anything like that. They just had the limb. That's basically all. Some guys did, because I know, some guys did. I don't know how they did it though, but some guys did, but many of them just had the limb. None of that took place at Spangler or at Camp Letterman.
Right. Where was the rest of the Second Corps in relation to the number 4 hospital? Steve would like to know.
The rest of the Second Corps hospitals?
Yes, I suppose.
Yes. Yeah. So the 1st Division, Second Corps Hospital, the guys that fought at the wheat field, they were at Granite Schoolhouse on Granite Schoolhouse Lane. The 2nd and 3rd Division hospitals were closer to the line on the Town Road. So if you know the battlefield at all and you're on the Granite Schoolhouse Lane and you drive to the Town Road, you make a left, and the other 2 division hospitals were down there on the Town Road, which was a problem because Granite Schoolhouse kept getting hit with Confederate artillery overshots. And that was farther away. So you can imagine the 2 other division hospitals, how much they were getting hit. So all 3 hospitals had to pick up on July 3rd, and they moved farther behind the line to safety. And they were out by where the modern day outlet, Gettysburg outlet mall is right now. Still along Rock Creek, but out of the firing.
Okay. So you sort of addressed this already, but the question is, what happened to the hospitals when the Confederates retreated and the medical personnel and soldier patients that were left behind? You kind of addressed that already,
Yeah.
but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, the one problem that they had, especially the 11th Corps ambulances, going out to Barlow Knoll, and some of the guys were at the seminary. I mean, the Confederates were still around, and especially the sharpshooters were still around. So it wasn't really safe yet. So they had to really hustle. And they were also afraid that I don't know that they did, but they were afraid that the Confederates were going to bomb the town. So they were still in some danger when they were out collecting on July 4th. It's a hard job.
Yeah.
I mean, the people that they chose for the ambulance job in 1862, the quartermaster department ran the ambulances, and so they would use them sometimes for ambulances and sometimes for clothes or food or whatever. But then Dr. Jonathan Letterman came in and he changed everything, and they were using citizens to run the ambulances, and these guys wouldn't go into the battle to pick up the wounded. So Letterman said, pick the best man in each regiment, pick the best men, train them how to step, train them how to pick up the stretcher without hurting them any further. And that's what they did. And so these are brave, smart guys who were caring, and they would go into the middle of a battle to get these guys out.
Nick would like to know, he says, Nate said, having been to the George Spangler farm, I know things have changed, but what was the view from the farm proper to the west in your estimate in July of 1863?
Well, when Nate was there, he probably saw a lot of trees behind the barn, quite a tree line. Those trees weren't there. There was pretty much an open field back then. And I can't really verify this now because of the trees that are back there that weren't there then, but I have a report in the book of a wounded soldier on the top floor of the barn who said he could see Pickett's charge. They could watch Pickett's charge from the top floor of that barn. So again, seems like a stretch to me, but it's possible. It's not that far away. And you know, they could hear it, and you know that they were shells from the pre-Pickett's charge cannonade were landing within 20 feet of the barn. And they had to evacuate all of the wounded out of that barn because they thought it was going to get hit and catch on fire. So they were involved in it too. Again, they were the only hospital that stayed. Everybody else moved away.
So they would have been aware of it. Whether they could see it is.
Yeah, they felt like, I mean, the shells, if they come within 20 feet of the barn, I guess they felt they had reached their maximum distance. I don't know, but I guess they were fortunate. Maybe they knew exactly what they were doing.
Here's a great question. How did you make the transition from working as a news journalist to writing about the Civil War?
It was always kind of a doing it at the same time kind of thing. Once I read The Killer Angels back around 1980, it was like, okay, I'm in this now. And then I just read while I was working. And then I semi-retired. USA Today was my last job. And I said, well, now's my chance. I never had time to volunteer. I'm going to volunteer over at the foundation in Gettysburg. So I did. In a couple of weeks after I was volunteering, the volunteer coordinator said, Ron, we're going to open the Spangler farm and we need guides out there. Would you be interested? And I said, sure, but what's the George Spangler farm? So I did it. Each year I learned more. And that was 2013. And by 2015, 2016, I'm asking the foundation, where's the book on this place? This place is crying for a book. He said, we don't have one, we need one. So in 2016, I start thinking, I'm going to write a 100-page booklet. But there was just so much to be found. And there's so much in the battle that you can relate to Spangler, like the 9th Massachusetts Battery Horses on Trousseau. They were a Spangler. So every part of the line, every day of the fight, Spangler was involved. So that's why I came up with a 400-page book.
It's a great topic, and I'm glad that you wrote it. Brian would like to know how long it took to research and how long to write.
3 years. The first thing I did was I spent 1 month in the Gettysburg Foundation offices upstairs in the visitor center because they had already done some research. A gentleman by the name of Dan Welch, and many of you might know Wayne Motts, had done some research, and a National Park Service researcher by the name of Kathleen George Harrison. And they were all up there in boxes. And it was just stuck away, you know, out of the public's eye. So I went through their boxes and their notebooks. It took me a month. And that month of work saved me a year, at least, of research. So it was a 3-year project. It would have been a 4-year project if not for that. And it took us, Barb and I went to Kansas to see where Daniel Spangler lived, the 3rd child. And we took photos of his grave. It's a beautiful cemetery. And we went to see where his son drowned in the Smoky Hill River. We learned a lot like at Cornell, and lots of time at the archives in DC and the Army War College were great places. Because if somebody writes a book about the 145th Pennsylvania, there might be a paragraph or two about the farm, Spangler Farm. If I find a paragraph or two, I'm good to go. I have something else. So I just kept looking for little nuggets all that time.
It's interesting how it's all connected, one event to another, isn't it? And
It
one
is.
regiment or brigade or division to another.
And I had no idea about that when I started researching the book.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, we have enjoyed this very much, and we appreciate again. Thank you so much for coming tonight and answering all the questions. You guys hang on for just a minute so that we can show you and kind of promote Ron's book a little bit. We want everybody to know that all of our presenters provide these presentations without compensation. And so we always encourage folks to order their own copy of the book. And our friends at Savas Beatty want to thank everyone for adapting to the current normal and for participating in the event. And as a result, they have offered a 20% discount when you order through Savas Beatty. Good for Mr. Kirkwood's book, Too Much for Human Endurance, the George Spangler Farm Hospitals and the Battle of Gettysburg. Just go to the website and add the book to your cart. And when you check out, enter the code that Tina's entering in the chat box, and you will receive 20% off of your total purchase. And I know we mentioned it earlier, but the second edition is likely to sell out soon. So if that happens before you get a chance to get your order in, coming in January of 2021, the book will be coming out in soft cover paperback, and you can order it then. But in the meantime, if you're ordering from Savas Beatty's website, enter the code that Tina's entered in the chat box, and you'll receive 20% off on your entire purchase. So you can buy more than one book and receive 20% off of the entire purchase. Next week, we want to let you know that our guest will be Kenneth R. Rutherford on America's Buried Treasure, Landmines in the Civil War. And Kenneth will be with us the same time on Wednesday night of next week. And we'll be talking about his book, America's Buried History, Landmines in the Civil War. Hope you'll join us then. And after that, we have a great lineup scheduled all the way through the year and into the next year. So I hope everybody will join us for all these programs. We've got Steve Norder on December 2nd, Christopher Loperfido on December 9th, another medical program for those who have enjoyed tonight's program. Bradley Gottfried will be with us on December 16th for the maps of the cavalry in the Gettysburg campaign. John Corstein will be back with us on December 30th. I know those who attended last time when John was with us will want to catch that again. And if you didn't, you'll definitely want to catch it because he's very engaging presenter, and his program will be on the USS Monitor almost on the anniversary of that event. And then on January 13th, we'll have Lance Hertigan back, and he'll talk to us more about the Iron Brigade. And he was very, it was so interesting, his program, the last time he was with us, and this time he will be showing us his slide deck. So Lance will be back on January 13th, and on January 20th at 8:30 p.m. we'll have Matt Atkinson. He's a Gettysburg National Military Park Ranger, and his topic is, I believe, going to be determined or announced later, but it may be on General Lee. Is that right, Ashley?
General Lee celebrating.
Yeah, he's going to do General Lee because it's the day after his birthday or the day
Oh,
on his
okay.
birthday. So
Okay, so Matt will be here that day on January 20th. That's a Wednesday, and all of our programs are always at 8:30 on Wednesday night. Don't forget, our next presentation will be on Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time and features Ken Rutherford on his book, America's Buried History, Landmines in the Civil War. I hope you'll join us then. And thanks for tuning in tonight. See you next Wednesday at 8:30.
Thank you.